Welcome to a series of presentations on assessing options for drought response. This is the first in the series, Introduction and Overview, prepared by Marie Bowen and myself, Fred Chudleigh. So the aims of the project is to help industry. It's to help industry prepare, respond, recover from drought. And we hope to do that by looking at knowledge that people need to prepare, respond, recover for drought, and some of the skills that we can share that assist decision making. So we're about providing a decision making framework and tools rather than answers. The project team are Marie Bowen, ruminant nutritionist, Fred Chudleigh, myself, economist, Giselle Wish, a grass modelling expert, and pasture scientist. Not a big project team, but we're ably supported by people from regions across Northern Australia. So our regions in Queensland that we've looked at are the Fitzroy, the Northern Gulf, the Central West Mitchell grasslands around Longreach. We're looking at the Northern Downs, and we hope to look at the Mulga lands and eventually the goldfields. We'll see if we run out of time before we get there. We've also done a fair bit of work with the Northern Territory team in Katherine on some of the production systems in their region, and they're available as part of this project as well. Now, in preparing for drought, we've already done 2 webinars that are available on the Future Beef website that set out a series of examples for the regions of Fitzroy, Far North Queensland Gulf, and Trudy's help with the Northern Territory examples, looking at improving the performance of beef production systems in Northern Australia. So they're about getting the system right, profitable, resilient, prior to drought. We also added to that another webinar that looked at low-cost strategies to build resilience. So age of turn-off, getting the body condition right, things like that help you prepare for drought. So those 2 are available. We've now got, if you want to go, that 7 in this series on responding to drought. This is the introduction and overview. We're going to go through a step-by-step process where we look at different decisions that can be made in responding to drought and how you might assess them. We've got them numbered 1 to 7, but they're not necessarily needed to be followed in that order if you don't really want to. If you want to jump to number 6 instead of number 2, well, away you go. But we've got them numbered. We think they sort of flow in this series, but it's not necessary. You can jump around if you like. So we've also got 2 presentations about recovery from drought. They're available on the Future Beef website. They look at options for recovery, how you might rebuild your herd effectively during that recovery phase, the role of things like adjustment and buying cattle, trading cattle, buying back breeders. Then we go to a little bit more complex example where we look at the impact of climate variability on this capacity to analyse response and recovery strategies. When it becomes a little bit more complex and modelling it in grasp, can we get better answers out of it? So that's number 9. Drought response strategies, the context. The context is, here's drought, here's prior to drought, here's drought recovery, and you can see most of the page is tied up with the impact of drought. It's what we spend most of our time planning for, preparing for, so it's the biggest third, you might say, on the page. It does overwhelm us a little bit because of the nature of the impact of drought on the beef production systems of the north, but we are saying you've got to think about it in the overall context and put things in place before drought. So prior to drought, there's decisions that are made to prepare, and they're about what's most profitable and drought resilient to have in place on your property prior to drought. So what's the herd management strategies like age of steer turn-off that best suits your property, your target markets, your production system? What cow and heifer culling strategies make your herd drought resilient and profitable? Do you need to think about control mating, segregation strategies? Then we can have a whole raft of things under stocking rate that you can look at to give your cow's body condition, growth rates, all sorts of things to prepare for drought, to make your property more profitable and resilient. Land management, and under that heading, we not only include pasture management, things like that, but we also think about things like planting perennial legumes in the north and in the Fitzroy, things like the stylos and lequinas, and their role in strategically making the property more drought resilient in those regions. So we've got all this prior to drought thinking that we've discussed in the documents that we prepare for each region and in our previous webinars. In this series, we're going to look at drought response. We're going to look at the choices in that drought response. So in those choices, they look at components of the herd. They look at the costs and benefits and the risks of doing something when you respond. What's going to happen when you make a choice to do something with part of your herd in response to drought? Then that obviously, the intersection there of those three parts of the drought response, or three parts of the choice, is where we're going to concentrate on in the 7 presentations we've got coming up. Now that obviously leads on to, hopefully, the end of the drought, and we've got to look at, during the drought recovery, what are our medium-term outcomes we want to look at? What's their impact on future profit and cash flow? Now that relates to the choices we made back here, and those are driven by what's the most profitable and drought resilient system to have in place. So this original choice over here is what we lead on to. So coming into the drought recovery phase, we always know the end of the last flood is the start of the next drought. That's the sort of thinking that we've developed over years here in Queensland, that the next drought is not too far away. It's going to consume a lot of our thinking. It doesn't necessarily take up a lot of the time in a lot of production systems, but it's consuming our thinking. So we've got to have the context right for how we go about these drought response decisions. Questions that arise when responding to drought. We've got some cows here out on the Barkly before the drought that's been out there for the last couple of years, so you can see that they were doing all right. So what are the questions that arise when these cows went into the droughts of 2 years ago and last year? So do I sell them? Do I adjust them somewhere else? Do I feed them in the paddock where they are, or do I take a chance on it raining? How are these options compared? If I sell, what do I sell first? And why? Does my response now decide what's available during the recovery phase? So the questions can be broken down into what are the options? How do I compare them? Amongst this, if I have to sell something, what do I sell first? And how do I think about the longer term when I'm responding? To look at answering those questions, we've built an example based on a North Queensland forest breeder property located somewhere up here in this lower Cape York Peninsula. Fairly difficult production environment for the beef industry, but it's interesting because of its nature. Even though it's a difficult production environment, the same method we're going to apply to assessing these strategies applies to all beef production systems anywhere that are responding to drought. So our example here we chose because of its interesting nature, but these methods apply to anywhere. And you've got to remember, the method can give you a different answer for the same property at different stages of the drought. Things change rapidly. And at the same time, you and your neighbour can be doing an analysis of your options and come up with different answers. So the answers are very specific on what's going on. So all the way through this, the tools and planning process stay the same. So the answers might change each time you do this analysis because the inputs have changed, but the tools and the process stay the same, and we're concentrating on the tools and the process. And we believe, even though it's really difficult, when you're responding to drought and the workload is up, the stress levels are up, the ability to think is down, it is really necessary to put in place steps that allow you to keep planning and making a best estimate of the likely costs and benefits of the alternative courses of action. You've got to keep planning, you've got to keep that ability. Now, the tools that we're going to apply, they're all examples that come from the Breed Cow Dynamo program that's available on the DAF Queensland website at this location. You can see there's the home page for Breed Cow Dynamo and software. We're going to, if anything that's not in the Breed Cow Dynamo software, we're going to provide to you as a spreadsheet on our Future Beef Home Soap page. So all the spreadsheets we use examples through these series of presentations are going to be available one way or the other if you want to look at them. The crystal ball. There are significant constraints on any of these drought analyses, and you've got to remember that. We don't have a crystal ball. There's one there on the page, but we don't really have a real one. So you've got to deal with unknowns. We can't peer into the crystal ball and know the future. There are unknowns. Very difficult to successfully predict the cost of a drought, how long it's going to be, anything like that. So what we've got to do is say, we want you to allocate what you expect will happen based on experience, seasonal timing of the decision, and the current market circumstances. So you've got to sit down and say, what can I learn if you haven't been around in the beef industry for a long time? What can I learn from the experience of others? What sort of responses are available? What time is it now? It's part of the drought, and what's the market look like? So these, if you put these into your decision-making process, often it will highlight the differences between the options, and that'll be good enough for you to understand what it will take to make them work. That's all we're about. So the next one in the series is situational analysis.